Welcome life science learners to another installment. I trust that you guys are well and you're going to interact today with us. We're looking at today the human reproductive system, and we're going to spend some time looking at the male and female reproductive systems. This is an important topic as it leads to understanding how the process of reproduction takes place, and hence it's important that we first look at the structure of the male and the female reproductive system. So let's get into the lesson and have an overview of the main concepts in this lesson. In our lesson today, we're going to spend some time looking at an overview of the male reproductive system, the parts and their structures and functions, and we will spend some time looking at the female reproductive systems. We will then move on to looking at the details of how the male reproductive system works and do that as well for the female reproductive system. As a reminder, as we start this lesson, it is important for us to be able to recognize that when we're looking at biological diagrams and concepts, it is important that when we look at, for example, the male reproductive system, we study from a diagram, that we're able to label the diagram, and that we're able to identify the functions. So the golden rule is learn a diagram, learn the labels, understand the structure, and explain their functions. So I'll kind of put that down so that you remember what this is and apply that to the context of whatever we're doing in life sciences. So the rule is learn a diagram and the diagram is the best way to learn a diagram is to actually draw a diagram. And so drawing is important in being able to help you remember. So draw the diagram, you will then provide labels for them, and then look at each label and look at the structure of that part, and then try and understand how that part actually carries out its specific function. So in our next segment, we're going to look at structure, and then we're going to follow that with looking at the details of each structure and their functions. So as we look at the male reproductive system, it is important that we understand what is the main components of the male reproductive system. So what does it consist of? So as we get into this section, we're going to look at the male reproductive system containing a pair of testes. It has a system of tubes that are essentially important for the transportation of sperms and certain secretions. We're also going to look at some glands that are associated with the male reproductive system, and we refer to them as the accessory glands. And we're going to look at the organ, the penis, which is used during copulation. Right. So as I mentioned, it is important that we have diagrams, and the simpler the diagram, the more convenient and easier it is to understand the structure. So I've put in a very schematic diagram so that it makes it easier for us to be able to identify parts. These diagrams often come in different views, and so what we're looking at today is the front view of the male reproductive system. And as we look at this, it's important that we try and recognize, firstly, what are the parts, and then we will look at the structure and their function. So let's look at just identifying the parts. So as I said, the male reproductive system consists of a pair of testes which we find located in a sac that extends below the lower abdomen, and that is the scrotum. So we find that the testes are suspended in a sac, and that's called the scrotum. We have a pair of the testes. These in turn produce secretions and sperms, and they are transported via a tube called the sperm duct, or in some textbooks, it's referred to as the vas deferens. So as you would see, you've got a tube on either end that transports the sperm from the point in which they're produced, which are here in the testes, to where they are going to be released into the tube called the urethra. So we have a common tube called the urethra that carries both secretions from the testes as well as urine from the bladder. So it's a common tube that carries both semen as well as urine. So that's the urethra. We also have on the surface of the testes a coiled tube called the epididymis. And so if we look at both the testes, we're seeing a coiled tube on the surface of the testes. The structure and function of that would be discussed in detail as we move into the next part of it. We also know that there are accessory glands that are associated with the male reproductive system, and these are the prostate gland, the seminal vesicle, and we also have the Cowper's gland. And that unfortunately can only be seen in the side view. So the three glands that are important are the prostate gland, the seminal vesicles, as well as the Cowper's gland. And so we will look at those in detail in a bit. So that's an overview of that. What is important is that we're able to recognize that the penis is made up of a specialized tissue called erectile tissue. And this erectile tissue essentially fills up with blood upon stimulation and becomes erect. And we'll discuss what an erection is later on in the session. If we look at the female reproductive system, we can look at it and deconstruct it looking at the following structures. So we have a pair of ovaries. We've got the organs that are responsible for the transportation of the egg from the ovum from the ovary into the fallopian tube. And we also have the external genitalia, which is the vulva. A closer look at that in a diagram looks like this. So as I mentioned, we've got a pair of ovaries. We have a system of tubes called the fallopian tubes, which carry the eggs into a muscular organ called the uterus. Okay, so that's important for us to be able to recognize as we look at an overview. We also have the vagina through which copulation takes place. We have an opening between the uterus and the vagina called the cervix. And lining the uterus, we have a lining called the endometrium. We have finger-like projections at the ends of the fallopian tube called fimbriae. And so this is essentially what it looks like in the side view. So again, looking at those parts, we're able to identify the uterus as a muscular organ. We're able to see that just below the uterus, in front of it, is the bladder. We have an opening called the urethra, which is different to the male reproductive system, which is a separate tube in the females. In the side view, we can see the fallopian tube and we can see the position of the ovaries. We're also able to identify the position of the vagina and the location of the cervix. So guys, we've looked at an overview of the male system and the female systems just to understand the parts. It is important that you're able to identify, firstly, the parts on a diagram. In our next segment, we're going to look at each structure, its adaptation for its function, and we'll discuss more details around how these parts work. Thank you for staying tuned. Have a little break, and we'll see you in a short while.